Okay, good evening, everyone. It's great to see you. My name is John Harper. I'm Senior Adjunct Professor here and Professor Emeritus at Johns Hopkins University. And welcome to our event entitled Trump, Harris, and the Transatlantic Future, a roundtable in honor of David Calleo, Professor David P. Calleo. And first, I'd like to say that the Rector de Hoos sends his regards to everyone. He regrets he can't be here this evening. I'd also like to thank Alessandra Nakamu, as usual, for her, as usual, impeccable organization and help in getting this, in organizing this event. I'd also like to mention that this event is supported by funds from the Patrick McCarthy Memorial Fund, and which is very appropriate because Patrick, I think, was recruited to SAIS in the 1970s from Haverford College. He began teaching at SAIS thanks to David Calleo. They were good friends. And of course, Patrick became a resident here where he taught for many years. I think many of you know David or knew David as his colleague or friend or his student, but I suspect a majority of you also listening to the webinar did not know David, and I'd like to say a few things about him. David Calleo was one of the most original and multifaceted scholars and commentators on international affairs of his generation. He founded in 1968, and he managed, he directed until his retirement in 2012, the SAIS European Studies Program, which was, I think it's fair to say, the preeminent American graduate program for the study of contemporary Europe. And it's one that trained hundreds of professionals working in business, in diplomacy, in government, in journalism, and so on. David supervised some 40, I think this is what is unique about him in the SAIS faculty, he supervised some 40, at least 40 PhD dissertations. And he was a marvelous supervisor, and including the dissertations of three of the people on this panel, Professors Allin, Professor Ed Jones, and myself. And let me stop and introduce the panel properly. And I'm going to introduce them in the order that they'll be speaking. I hope they're happy with the order. Dana, although he's at the far end, will be going first. Dana Allin is adjunct professor at SAIS Europe. He's the editor of Survival, and he's a senior fellow for the Transatlantic Affairs at the International Institute of Strategic Studies in London, where he's based. He's a graduate of the Bologna Center, a prolific author and commentator in the field of American foreign policy. Professor Erik Jones is also a graduate of the Bologna Center and of the SAIS European Studies program. He was a member of the faculty here, resident faculty here for many years, and before becoming the director of the SAIS European Studies department after David's retirement in 2012. This was all before taking up his present position as director of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the EUI, the European University Institute in Fiesole. He is a prolific author and commentator as well in the field of contemporary European politics and political economy. Next, we're delighted to have with us Robert Skidelsky, Professor Emeritus of Political Economy at the University of Warwick, member of the House of Lords, fellow of the British Academy, and not to mention a former member of the faculty here at the Bologna Center, as it was known in those days. He's the author, among other works, as many of you will know, of the definitive biography of John Maynard Keynes. And I doubt if he remembers it, but I think when he was working on the first volume of that biography in 1976, he had me as a student in his class on contemporary British politics. And Robert was for many years a very good friend and a sparring partner. Well, not literally, but let's say an intellectual sparring partner of David Calleo. And last but not least, it's really a special honor and pleasure to introduce our dear friend Avis Bohlen, who's traveled from Washington for this event. Avis served for 25 years as a career Foreign Service officer and 30 years overall with the US government. Her positions included Assistant Secretary for Arms Control, US Ambassador to Bulgaria, Deputy Chief of Mission at the US Embassy in Paris. And no one is better placed than Avis to address tonight's topic or to comment, if she'd like to, on David's views of the subject than Avis is, since along with her distinguished career, she was David's life partner for over 45 years. And I'd like to add that Avis has just completed a full-length biography of Charles E. Bohlen, her father, who was one of the most important American diplomats of the 20th century, the man who interpreted for Roosevelt and Stalin at the Yalta Conference, among many other things that he did. Now, our purpose tonight isn't really to try to imagine what David himself would say on the subject we're discussing, but despite what Dana has warned us not to do, I find it hard to resist doing just that. Because the transatlantic relationship was really at the heart of David Calleo's concerns as a scholar. And he had very definite, and for an American, rather iconoclastic views on that subject, views influenced by his attachment to the ideals of Charles de Gaulle. And one of David's books, which was written, I think published in 1987 towards the end of the Cold War, was called Beyond American Hegemony. And as that suggests, he was an advocate of what today people like to call European strategic autonomy, meaning not a transatlantic divorce, but a much more self-reliant Europe of the kind favored by de Gaulle and also by American commentators such as George Kennan. To put it somewhat differently, David, I think it's fair to say, had a certain idea of Europe and a certain idea of the United States. He believed that the system of interstate cooperation embodied in the EU, with all its messiness and its flaws, was a healthy alternative to both hegemonic and balance of power systems, and a possible model for other parts of the world. He saw a united Europe as a corrective, at least potentially, to American imperiousness and tendency toward insolvency at home, imperiousness abroad and tendency towards insolvency at home. At one point, David spoke, paraphrasing the great British Foreign Secretary George Canning, of calling the old world into existence, meaning a strong, autonomous Europe to restore the balance of the new. In any case, it's a vision of Europe as part of the solution to the world's problems, rather than itself the problem, as Europe had been for much of the 20th century. As for his own country, David was skeptical of the view of the United States as an indispensable nation, let alone the lead wagon on the path to the end of history, to use Fukuyama's image. America was historically unexceptional, prone to the same passions, temptations, and self-deceptions as earlier empires and great powers. But at the same time, David's America was also an America in search of the better angels of its nature, as Lincoln had put it, and able to find those better angels in times of need. Knock on wood. A last point before I give the floor to our speakers, and especially those of you who didn't know David, don't remember him. Along with his erudition, what most distinguished David was his temperament, his personality, his gift for friendship, his zest for life, his joie de vivre. And the best way I could think of that, to try to convey that to you, is to show you a few pictures taken here exactly 12 years ago in October 2012 during an event held in his honor. And I don't need to add much to them. I think they speak for themselves. And here we are. David and Professor Vera Zamani, who it's a pleasure to see sitting right under my nose. By the way, I forgot I don't know how you go back, but on the far left, you had Simon Serfati, who was the first director of the Bologna Center after the founder, Grove Haynes. Here you have David together with Erik. David and our distinguished friend and professor is also in the audience, Gianfranco Pasquino, who it's a pleasure to see here tonight. You haven't changed, Gianfranco. Sei uguale, esattamente uguale. Anche tu, Vera. David and Adrian Littleton sitting here in the front row. David and Giorgio Lamalfa, who sends his regrets. We were hoping that he could make it tonight, but he was unable to come. That's a classic picture of David, I think. David and yours truly. I wonder, I was looking for that tie. I can't find it anymore. And I can't but mention our dear friend in the back over David's shoulder, our dear late friend, Catherine Knowles. And I think that was the picture we used for the dépliant of the event. So now I'm going to go back. I'm going to give the floor to Dana. Dana, do you want to stay there? You want to come up here? And okay.
Thanks, John. And that was really delightful to see those pictures and some of those memories, which I guess was 11 years ago. Okay, well, this was not a program of advanced math and that David led. About a week and a half ago, the Financial Times did one of its so-called big read pieces titled "The World According to Kamala Harris." And among other things, the writers asked whether Joe Biden would be the last of the Cold War era transatlanticists, I'm quoting here, or whether President Harris, if she becomes president, would continue that tradition. And it kind of put forward ambiguous evidence for both alternatives in pointing to her national security advisor, Philip Gordon. On the one hand, they said, quote, Gordon is a noted Atlanticist and would keep her wedded to Europe. On the other hand, Gordon has an overarching realist view in which Europe is just one part. Now, there's nothing absolutely wrong with this framing, but it's a little bit off. Because Phil Gordon was a PhD student of David Calleo's at the same time I was in the late 1980s. And he wrote his thesis, in fact, on David's hero, Charles de Gaulle, and on the Gaullist legacy in French foreign policy. And one of the things you had to learn if you were a student of David's, and especially if you focused on de Gaulle, was that a devotion to Europe and a realist worldview were not contradictions. They were closely bound together. David called himself, I said this at his memorial event, and he actually said it to me. I don't know if he did it very often, but in my presence, he called himself a liberal realist. In this, and in many things, he was really my lifelong teacher. He was a liberal in the sense, he was a liberal in a number of ways, including the sense that he stood on the center left of American politics. But his realism expressed a kind of innate conservatism that was evident in two great themes of his work, balance and decline. Now, in preparing these remarks, John alluded to this. I wanted to be careful to emphasize what I learned from David rather than what he taught me, because the point of the distinction is to not make specific claims about what he would say if he were alive today. Yet the conservatism that I'm talking about was embedded in a profound attachment to constitutionalism, both written and unwritten, with unwritten meaning organic, traditional, and norms-based, although he wouldn't use such an ugly word as norms-based. And the disruptions to these norms that we are seeing today, in the long shadow of January 6, 2001, the discourse that former President Trump's appointed military chief has called fascist, eating cats and dogs, rounding up internal enemies, flouting constitutional principles and limits. These, I'm quite confident, David would perceive, and in fact he did perceive before he died, as manifestations of a sharp decline in American politics and political culture. Why is the American constitutional balance in such danger? Well, I don't have time. And I don't know. First, I don't know, and second, I don't have time. But just to mention one plausible factor among many, I will recall that David worried about the imbalances of the American economy that might lead to political destabilization. He worried about NAFTA and globalization in the 1990s. He was an admirer of the Chinese and of China and a visitor to China, but he worried about the China shock in the 2000s. Now, to be honest, I'm not sure I ever heard David propound a viable alternative to globalization, but I do think he was properly scornful of the notion that free market mechanisms would solve the problem by making everyone richer, or even more egregiously, that the losers from globalization should be expected to simply accept their fate. Let me explain a little bit more about the idea of organic constitutionalism that I think I learned from David. And this brings me to a conclusion about the transatlantic future. Donald Trump's possible, very possible second presidency threatens a transatlantic crisis. Now, this is true even if you admire Donald Trump and believe that the crisis is just what the alliance needs. 20 years ago, there was a crisis provoked by the Iraq War. I'm not making any equation between Presidents Bush and Trump, but it was a crisis then. And David, who strongly opposed that war and saw it, I think, as a consequence of a too powerful presidency overpowering American domestic constitutional balance, wrote in my journal that with a strong enough Europe, there would be a kind of organic transatlantic constitution that could restrain American recklessness. This was a very complicated idea he had that I'm beyond my ability to really get into now. But this was in keeping with his decades-long work on problems of transatlantic balance. John mentioned Beyond American Hegemony, which was the first project I helped him with. And it was an extended argument that Europeans were rich enough and capable enough to take on the main responsibility for their own defense, and that furthermore they should do so in order to relieve America's imperial overstretch. Beyond American Hegemony was published in 1987, that when I was a graduate student here. 37 years later, we face a war of conquest in Europe. Now, the European allies have actually done quite a bit to build up their military capabilities. I mean, at the time that David wrote the book, they had actually rather impressive military capabilities, but which have withered with the end of the Cold War. After Russia's annexation of Crimea, they responded rather impressively. But for all of this real and significant progress, they remain in a condition of learned helplessness. We are 2 weeks before an election in which a candidate who is tied in the polls says, if he wins, he will cut off Ukraine and make a deal with Putin. Europeans, as far as I can see, are in no way prepared for this. They don't know what they would do. They literally do not know what they would do in the event of a very plausible scenario that could take form 16 days from now. Now, David Calleo was the farthest thing from a Europe basher. On the contrary, he had a resolute faith in the promise of a Western civilization balanced between Europe and America, not dominating the world, but holding its own in a balanced, pluralist system of world power. One reason for his faith in Europe was his admiring assessment of the European achievement in its recovery and moral rejuvenation after the Second World War. And his wisdom on this fabulous achievement is really one of the things he taught me, without, I should say, making me comparably wise. And yet, for all of its achievements, Europe remains in a condition not just of strategic military dependency, but a kind of cognitive dependency. In too many areas, it still waits for America to decide. And this, as David warned for much of his career, is the logical consequence of 3/4 of a century of strategic dependence. With more time, there are many other dimensions that I would talk about, which we might get to, including NATO enlargement, Ukraine's potential membership, and my colleagues may speak on some of this. I just want to finish by coming back to David Calleo as a human being and as a person, as a teacher. In the first 15 years of this century, David wrote frequently for my journal and went on the masthead as a contributing editor. His pieces included review essays, including one that started with the words, "Hard times make good books." It happens that this was a review of Robert Skidelsky's, if I remember correctly, this was a review of his friend Robert Skidelsky's Return of the Master, which was not his 3-volume biography of Keynes, but a return to Keynes after the 2007-2008 financial crisis. Hard times make good books was not just a bromide about the positive uses of adversity. It was a serious moral point that I would say reflected David's view that optimism was a kind of ethos. And we've spoken, and you may have seen in these pictures, those who don't know him, a certain characteristic gleam in David's eye. He had a moral vision that was full of grace, but was also part of this kind of romantic, very broad approach to scholarship and stupendously graceful writing. These characteristics did so much to imbue this place, here and in Washington, with its ethos. And in these hard times, we could surely use David's counsel. We'll have to make do with his memory and his inspiration, and of course, the intellectual legacy, such as it is, of all his students.
Next, I'd like to ask Erik, if you would like, you can stay where you are if you prefer, but however you want to do it.
I'm not going to let Dana go up there and then I sit here. Wow, this is great. I lectured hundreds of hours behind this podium, and I've been away for three years, and it's awesome to be back again, except it's much more technologically sophisticated, so I find it a little bit unnerving. I have way too many people in this room I owe debts of gratitude to, but one thing that David did to me that was completely unexpected was that he introduced me to Robert Skidelsky and then convinced Robert to read the first 5 pages of my dissertation. And we sat on a beach on Elba, and Robert looked at me and said, "You really need to learn how to write." And it was one of the most instructive moments that I had, and so I'm hopeful I'll get through this presentation without violating some of the key principles that he instilled in me over the next 15 minutes. Which was the most trenchant, effective, and efficient critique I ever got in dissertation writing, I have to say. All leavened by the sharp stones on the beach at Northsea. Look, I want to make 5 points about the transatlantic relationship that come directly out of David's teachings, but that reflect precisely what's going on right now, because I do think many of you came here expecting something about Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, and the future of the transatlantic relationship, and there is something for us to say. And the first thing is that David always believed that the transatlantic relationship is a necessary relationship, that there are just too many problems out there in the world that are too big for even the largest power, the United States, to tackle on its own, and that it must cooperate with other countries. And cooperation with other countries involves a bunch of give and take. It's not a question of just instructing these countries to do what you say. The George W. Bush version of leadership doesn't apply either. You don't just do what you want, no matter what they say. There has to be some kind of interaction. And this interaction comes right out of his experience at the end of the Johnson administration, where they were actually wrestling with the problem of economic interdependence. The most famous book on the economics of interdependence, written by Richard Cooper in 1968, is effectively an argument for why even the most powerful country must learn to cooperate with other countries if it's going to achieve its goals. And when you look at the breakdown in the rules-based multilateral system, then you see precisely what is at stake. Because without the transatlantic relationship and without a rules-based multilateral system, our ability to tackle issues like climate change is effectively zero. And if you're worried about the amount of rain that's falling on Bologna, just imagine what another degree Celsius will add in terms of the water carrying capacity of the atmosphere, and you can only think of the damage that will create. And the only way that we can address that is by working across the Atlantic and using that transatlantic relationship to re-galvanize a global partnership that will allow us to effectively tackle climate change. And David, I think, would have agreed with that. The problem, he would have argued, and this is the second point, is that as in many relationships, there's an abusive partner, and the United States is serially the abusive partner. The United States did many things that David documented throughout the 1970s and 1980s to abuse its position as hegemon in the international system to extract rents from Europe because it could. It had the dollar, it had the control of the international trading economy, it could set the rules of the game, and in doing so could skew competition to benefit the United States. We call that now the weaponization of interdependence. And if you were to look at what the United States does to the nodes in the internet, for example, in order to ensure that it has access to all the data that flows through it, or its ability to track payments, or its ability to disrupt any form of communication, cutting countries off of things like SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications, you'll see that the United States remains the abusive partner. And for Europeans, European banks having been the victims of the largest fines under this weaponization of dollar clearing, the Europeans are looking at this with increasing suspicion, particularly as Donald Trump came in 2016, cut Iran back out of the JCPOA and reinforced all of these sanctions and forced European countries to follow them. The European partnership looks at the United States and says, well, you know, that's not so great, right? We need to figure out some way to bring more balance into the relationship. And the weaponization of interdependence, unfortunately, has worsened that relationship in a very important structural way. And this is the third point. The only way the Europeans can actually respond is to pull themselves together. They have to unite in some effective way to offset the power of the United States. And unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be happening. It wasn't happening in the 1970s when David Calleo was writing about the America and the world political economy. It wasn't even happening in the 1960s when he was looking at Europe's future, the grand alternatives. And it's certainly not happening in the aftermath of the unipolar folly as the United States tried to go itself alone. And the Europeans were supposed to offset that by pulling themselves together. And the reason that it's not happening, and this is the fourth point, is because of the primacy of domestic politics and the centrality of the nation state. The problem is that Europeans have no greater facility to cooperate amongst one another than they have to cooperate across the Atlantic. And that's unfortunate. David pushed back against that consistently, trying to argue that there had to be some framework where Europeans could focus on their collective interests rather than on their national interests, some way to reconcile these two things. He believed in the power of nationalism, but he also respected its disruptive capacity. And we continue to see that now. I mean, if you look at what's going on in Germany and try to understand Germany's role in the Atlantic Alliance, if you look at the situation in French politics, you see how domestic politics can overcome any impetus toward European integration, and in so doing, perhaps restore legitimacy to the domestic political framing, but weaken the capacity at the same time of Europe to offset this disruptive potential of the United States. And unfortunately, that needs to change. And it's going to be very hard, particularly for Europeans, to change it. And this brings me to my fifth and final point, which is that change is possible. And I'm going to let that sink in for a second. Change is possible. Change is possible because we are changing the world economy. I think David would actually be quite comfortable with Bidenomics and with the foreign policy for the middle class because he was always a fan of Friedrich List. He was always a fan of an unconventional vision of the international political economy where the state played an active role in directing the development of industry. And when you look at what the Biden administration is doing right now, the deployment of non-market instruments in the United States is the central feature. And increasingly, the Europeans are responding in the same way. Look at the Draghi report. The Draghi report turns the whole conventional notion of competitiveness on its head and tries to push Europeans to accept the fact that the only way they will become competitive is through the deployment of non-market instruments, by which I mean tariffs and subsidies and other forms of incentives that will direct private capital into productive investment. The Draghi report argues that we have to do that, but in order to do that without destroying the internal market and the whole pattern of European integration that's been created, we need to centralize finances at the European level and generate a much greater degree of European solidarity than we've ever seen. And at the same time, we need to coordinate across the Atlantic because we have to make sure that the deployment of non-market instruments by European policymakers and those by American policymakers don't come into contradiction. This is exactly what David would have argued. It's exactly what he did argue in the 1970s and 1980s, and we happen to be in a world where that is the new paradigm that's gaining traction, and we're uniquely endowed to understand it simply because of the education we received in this place. Thank you.
Thank you, Erik. Robert, the floor is yours.
Is it me? Oh.
Yes, would you like to, if you prefer to stay where you are, you can.
I'll
You have
go
your-
up to the podium. I just recovered my text from my machine, which were we in this building before when I was here? It was also, was it the Andreata too? I don't remember that address.
The street wasn't called
The street's name has changed, but not the building is the same. Well, yeah, so it was a very happy time, my times here. And I also very much enjoyed the friendship of David. We met when we were in our early 20s, so I really knew him for about well over 50 years. And we didn't always agree on everything, but that was great because we had good arguments. And I had an incredible amount of support. I mean, I felt very supportive for his basic view. See, the reason he wasn't one of the great figures in international relations, he should have been, but he wasn't, was that he went against the grain of American foreign policy making and American thought. I mean, America was in its hegemonic mode. Someone who pointed out that America's frontier is someone else's house. as David did when he was talking about America and Europe. That wasn't the central idea of American foreign policy. So he was also a loner in that respect. And of course, he also had quite heterodox ideas about Europe, about the European Union, about Germany. His book on Germany was quite heavily criticized by the scholars of Germany, who thought he was generalizing wildly from inadequate premises and all that. So he had a lot of he suffered a lot of hassle, intellectual hassle in his life, and never quite got to the position, I think, that he deserved, and which now we need to recall, because the world is going mad. It's deranged and dangerous. And here's a voice of sanity and calm and wisdom, and we really ought to listen to it, because there are very few of them around. I just want to, now, if I can get this blasted machine to work, I'll try and capture something of David's personality through his work. As I said, we were close friends for over 50 years. All those who knew him well could sense the extraordinary unity between his life and his thought. His life proclaimed his ideals. He lived his ideals. And through his life, you could understand what those ideals were. I'll say a little bit about Casa Fangati in a moment, which was his little Platonic academy, which he set up on the island of Elba. There were no obvious tensions or loose pieces in David's personality. He was a complete work of art, you might say. And I want to capture something of his personality through his work because, as I said, his thinking remains indispensable. But let me start, I mean, in an international relations mode, with his ideal of order and how it fits into the discourse of interstate relations. And these are the sort of things we talked about the whole time, and they're still very, very relevant. I mean, the different ideas of how do you create order in a world out of a Hobbesian war of all against all. I mean, that was the starting point. And of course, there have been many models of order. I mean, the imperial rule is the earliest of the models, and it's lasted into modern times. It's not extinct. But since no one had world empire, how do you prevent the or limit into wars between the imperial states? I mean, that was the problem that imperialism always caused. You didn't have a world empire, you had several empires, you had several competing states. So what's the principle of order in that kind of world? Imperialism gives you control over certain territory, but not the whole world. There's never been a world empire. So the classic answer, European answer, was, of course, Westphalian, was Westphalia or the balance of power system. I mean, the ideal was a system of independent states forming a moral community and whose powers were so finely balanced that no one would have an incentive to try and disturb the order thus created. I mean, that was the ideal. Sometimes it worked all right. I mean, A.J.P. Taylor, the historian, said that in the 19th century, the balance of power worked like clockwork. But it didn't work in the end because it wasn't a static system. The calculations of power were always shifting, and therefore always at some point someone would have some incentive to try and upset the system and try to become an imperial power, and that of course was Germany, and Germany tried to do it twice. we have the imperial model, and we also have the balance of power model. Now, the important point is that America was never part of the balance of power system. It's never been part of a balance of power system. And that's a crucial difference between America and other European countries. First, it was isolationist, and then when it entered the stage, largely because the Europeans dragged it in, it was an imperialist from the beginning. It was a hegemon. So it never learnt or accepted, I mean, of course it knew, but it never accepted the kind of rules of the game of a balance of power system, which the Europeans had developed over centuries. And so we now, the current discussion of global order seems to me in this tradition. Unipolarity is the heir to empire, and multipolarity is the heir to the balance of power system, both projected onto the world stage. And colleagues and students of David won't need reminding how firmly set he was against the idea of unipolarity and the policy and rhetoric and hubris that goes with it. It's interesting to me that for a few years, and I don't know whether they shared the same corridor, Francis Fukuyama, the apostle of America's unipolar moment, and David both taught at SAIS in Washington. One of my memories, and I tried to remember what it was, I was asked, Francis Fukuyama asked me to write a reference for him, which I did, and whether or not as a result, probably not as a result, he got a professorship at SAIS. Did he and David discuss things together? They were simply opposite points of view there along the same corridor. I would have loved to eavesdrop on their conversations. I want to mention one particular strand of the unipolar model because I used to argue endlessly with David about this. Well, not argue so much, discuss with him, and that is Kindleberger's hegemonic stability thesis. I mean, Kindleberger, I mean, I don't know how many of you have ever sort of studied him. He drew his inspiration from public goods theory, and he postulated that you couldn't have an orderly world unless you had a hegemon, some power strong enough to provide the public goods for the whole system. The public goods being sort of liberal trade system, and of course the peace, which is the indispensable condition of a liberal trade system. And he said the reason the 20th century was so bloodthirsty, Kindleberger's view was that the hegemonic leadership was not there. Britain had provided it, in his view, in the 19th century, and then there was an interregnum until America took over the burden, as Kindleberger liked to put it, the hegemonic burden after the Second World War. And then after that, you got another stable system. And then that broke down. Now, Kindleberger made a very important point, which is he said that no hegemonic system is ever sustainable. It lasts for some time, but it then breaks down. Why does it break down? Because the hegemon lacks tax raising capacity. The hegemon cannot tax its subordinates for the support of the system because a hegemon isn't the same as a world government. So this essential lack of legitimacy means that the hegemon has to provide more and more special incentives to keep people within the system, and that eventually exhausts its resources. I mean, that very briefly was, and David caught on to this. He agreed with that, and he made it his own when he talked about the fiscal crisis, which America's hegemonic pretensions were forcing on the United States. So, I mean, that was the sort of area we discussed a great deal. Now, my last point then is if I can get my notes back. Now, when I wrote about Keynes, I said that philosophy was the foundation of his economics, and same one says about David. Philosophy was at the root of his approach to international affairs was basically philosophical. What were the elements of the philosophy? Plato is obviously there. Aristotle is obviously there. Catholicism. These are all foundation stones. So, I mean, in a way, they fused in his concept of idealism. And I don't think you can understand David's approach without understanding its philosophic roots. The trouble is we don't have any philosophic roots today. There are none. They've all been broken down. So the whole thing is a purely instrumental sort of discussion. But that wasn't true of David. He was very firm. That was his background. And what I wanted to say was he created this Platonic Academy in Elba, which all people on the panel, I think, and of course Avis, who was part of it. There was Plato's Academy. There was the philosopher king. David was sort of presided over this, but of course quite a lot of the friends of the philosopher king and rather lesser philosopher kings. And then there were the slaves. I mean, the slaves are a well-known phenomenon of Casa Fangati. The hierarchies of slaves. There was the kitchen slave. There was the garden slave. There was the research slave. We called them all slaves. Of course, they called themselves slaves humorously, but they were part of the whole community. And they took part in all of its activities. I mean, the philosopher kings didn't do any garden work, that has to be said. But the estate was beautifully kept up, and it was a beautiful thing. It was a beautiful construction. And I think, and I was there from the early 1970s till David finally couldn't keep it up any longer, over 40 years. So that's David, and I think the thing I want you to take away is that his work and his life formed a unity, and a work of art, I would say, which is very rare, and it has a huge amount to say to us in today's world, when we are going completely mad, and we're dividing the world into these malign powers and the good powers, and NATO has now become the world's policeman again. I mean, I can't bear to read any stuff on international relations at the moment. It's so horrendous. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. That was great. Thank you. Indentured servants was maybe more accurate than slaves, but one could debate that.
No, but we were called slaves, just to be clear.
David didn't like to call you slaves.
Oh, we called our, oh, I see.
You called yourself slaves. You got very sensitive.
The gulag was also used apparently occasionally as an Avis. You can stay there if you want.
No, come on.
Okay.
What a great picture. Well, I want to begin by just thanking all the members of the panel, but Dana, Allin, and John Harper especially for having organized this. I think David would have been so pleased. Lower, okay, all right. Yes, I just want to say that I wanted to thank particularly John Harper and Dana Allin for their work in organizing this, and not least of all for bringing me back to Bologna. It's such a pleasure to be here. It's been many years, and I find many familiar faces. Vera, Adrian, it's wonderful to see you all again. So there has not been very much talk after all about the Trump-Harris transatlantic future, and since I follow instructions, I want to just begin with that, and just to say, I need hardly tell you that this is a very tense moment in America, the election too close to call. Incredibly, none of us understand how it can be that close, and it's produced a high state of anxiety. And I think, they say when you're the last to speak, everything has been said, but just not everybody has said it. So at the risk of repeating what was said earlier, I think a Trump victory would obviously bode very ill for the transatlantic relationship. I think his negative views of NATO and the Europeans are all too well known. Would a second term be worse than a first term? I think in many ways, yes. Trump now knows the obstacles to what he wants to do and where to go after them. And the people he appoints will be more fervent loyalists. The first term, he had a fair number of reasonable people working for him, many of whom have now turned against him publicly and are supporting Kamala Harris. But that said, I think one has to discount some of the things that he is threatening to do. I think he is unlikely to do a number of the outrageous actions he has threatened. Even in a second term, there will be constraints on what he can do. And I'm not trying to pretend it won't be an ugly time if this happens. Even if he does not succeed in destroying the NATO alliance, his view of the transatlantic relationship as a transactional one is hardly the basis for an amicable relationship, and I think there will be stormy weather. He will certainly put an end to our assistance to Ukraine, which faces Europe with an enormous challenge, and he may well put pressure on Ukraine to accept a ceasefire and the loss of the Donbass as a price for peace. And he will certainly be raising tariffs on European countries as well as on China. Much else you can guess. He will continue. He will be even more supportive of Netanyahu in the Middle East. Some question marks. Will he cozy up to Putin and Orban? Maybe. Will he beat the war drums with China over Taiwan? But he's also capable of fits of, I don't know what, surprises. Witness his brief love affair with North Korea at the beginning of his first term. And obviously, if Kamala Harris wins, the results will be more reassuring. She will continue Biden's foreign policy in the main. She will continue to support NATO. She will continue to support Ukraine. She will not really basically change our Middle East policy. She will keep I think the relationship with China will continue to be an adversarial one, but with the efforts that we've seen from the Biden administration recently, trying to prevent the tensions from boiling over. But there will be changes, and I think this was alluded to, I think, by Dana, who asked whether Biden would be the last Cold War president, and I think the answer is yes. Kamala Harris has really does not have a huge amount of experience in foreign policy, in spite of having as her principal foreign affairs advisor Phil Gordon, who was a SAIS graduate and a former student of David's, as has been mentioned. And I think what will be different would be that she doesn't have the decades of relations with European leaders that Biden had and that that George H.W. Bush had. And she supports NATO, but she doesn't have the visceral feeling about NATO that somebody of Biden's generation does. And I think, I think there will be a generational difference in American foreign policy. And I think on the Middle East, she hasn't deviated from Biden's policy. I wouldn't expect her to. But again, the attachment to Israel is not as visceral, and she has sounded a note of greater concern about the Palestinians in her speeches than Biden did. And then I think beyond the obvious differences between the two candidates, we need to be aware of longer-term trends in America's view of the world. This has been going on for a long time, but I think many Americans in both parties are tired of being the hegemon, are tired of being the world's leading power. There is widespread sentiment that we should not be spending so much on Ukraine when there are needs at home. whether it be to police our southern border or to help struggling families. This is more prevalent among Trump supporters than Democrats, but it certainly is present in both parties. And there is a foreign policy fatigue, and I think this is maybe manifested most obviously by the significant decrease in support from Ukraine over the last year compared with the beginning of the invasion. Well, I don't think I've said anything that you don't already know or haven't read. So let me say a few words about David, to whom I was married for many years and who was, of course, as you've heard, a distinguished member of the SAIS faculty for 50 years and a teacher and mentor to 3 of the panelists here today. And I'm sorry that the younger members younger people who are here today did not have a chance to know him, because in addition to being a very thoughtful and wise commentator on America's role in the world, he was just wonderful company and lots of fun with a great sense of humor. And I think everybody enjoyed his company, one could say. And I will just say a few words about what Dana Allin aptly described as the dialectic of my relationship with him between dissent and establishment realism. We were both passionately interested in foreign policy and in the history of America's post-World War II involvement in the world, Europe especially, but we came at it from very different perspectives. I was a diplomat by profession, and my father was a diplomat. I grew up in a world where conversations revolved around the crisis of the day and surrounded by people who talked about foreign policy the whole time. But my father, and later myself, we were both very much of the establishment. And my father, while not uncritical of American foreign policy on many occasions, his basic default position was to be supportive of whatever the government was doing and to try to understand and explain what the factors were behind a certain position or action, even if the result was less than perfect. I'm reminded of a story that I heard the late George Shultz, Secretary of State under Reagan, tell. He was, in addition to serving often in the government and the cabinet of various Republican presidents, he was in and out of different businesses. He worked for Bechtel, various others, I can't remember. And he said he'd learned over the years that he would come into a business and wonder why this process was arranged in what seemed like a very illogical and unproductive fashion. And he said, I learned over the years that I should not try to change anything until I understood why it had come to be set up that way. What were the reasons behind it? And I thought those were some of the wisest words I ever heard. And I think that's the sort of approach of people like myself to government actions, not always, of course. And the fact is that if you work for the government, you are very aware of the constraints on power and the limits of government's freedom of action. David, on the other hand, was a born contrarian, a dissenter. His instinct was to challenge the accepted wisdom and put forward some other viewpoint. He was very much, as has been stated earlier, he was very much influenced by General de Gaulle and his criticisms of the United States. So the result in our marriage, and in fact even before it, David and I used to argue a great deal, as the other panelists can attest. Anybody who came to our dinner table, I think, may have probably witnessed some of these ferocious arguments. In his wedding toast to me, David said, among other things, that he looked forward to a lifetime of jolly arguments. And his wish was granted. And I think, to be honest, he enjoyed provoking me. And I, according to various friends, I always rose to the bait. He would express some outrageous view, and I would react. So these were heated arguments, but never bitter or angry. And I think in the course of our life together, we learned from each other. He, I think, learned something from my, quote, establishment realism, something about the constraints of power, the small space that exists where governments have freedom to act. I certainly learned from him. Among others, it was from him that I first heard the word hegemon. I'd never heard it before I met David. But I learned to be more critical of the accepted wisdom, to question decisions, and to step back and to take crises from the crisis of the moment. I recently encountered a SAIS graduate who had taken David's class on America and the world economy. And he told me how much it had influenced him, even though he was not a Europeanist. But he said it gave me a framework which has lasted all my life through which to look at the world. And I thought I can certainly say the same, and a most valuable gift it has been. So just to make a couple of points, what would David have made of the mad mess that the world is in today? He would certainly not be a Trump supporter for the reasons that others have suggested, his respect for constitutional order. But he would also find much to question in the Biden-Harris foreign policy. On Ukraine, in particular, he would undoubtedly say, "I told you so," or "What did you expect?" He was opposed to the expansion of NATO in the early 90s on the grounds that it was insensitive to Russia's interests, for want of a better phrase. Without defending Putin or his attack on Ukraine in any way, he would have seen something like the invasion of Ukraine as an inevitable Russian pushback. He predicted that NATO expansion was bound to lead to trouble. Now, this is a viewpoint that, I mean, one can argue ad infinitum without coming to any conclusion about it. But I think he did foresee certain consequences. Beyond that, as others have said, he had long felt that America was overextended with ambitious goals that led it to live beyond its means. The perennial American deficits were a subject of continuous criticism from him, a symptom for him of our inability to tailor ends to means. He would not have been surprised by America's foreign policy fatigue. He would have seen it as another sign that Washington's pretensions to world leadership was being stretched beyond the legitimacy of popular support. A continual theme for David, as others have mentioned, was that Europe should do more to assert itself as a power in its own right. This was an area which reflected very much his fascination with de Gaulle. It was a lifelong hope, and Europe's failure to develop in this direction was a continual disappointment. He believed that Europe, with its rich history and experience, deserved to be a power in its own right, but he also believed that a more independent and assertive Europe would provide a healthy check on America's overreach. He would hope, I think, that Trump's alienation from Europe might push the Europeans to finally get their act together, to take greater responsibility for their own defense and security. And if that happened, he might say that Trump had not been all bad, but then there would have been an argument with me.
That was super, Avis. Thank you so much. And we will open it up to you if there are questions. Also, people watching online, if you would like to use the Q&A function, I'll try to see if I can manage that. I just wanted to mention in response to Robert, he mentioned that Fukuyama and Calleo were actually on this, I don't know whether they had offices on the same floor, but I think by the early 2000s, Fukuyama had soured on unipolarity, and David and Fukuyama were on the same side on the bitter debate over the Iraq War. I think a majority of the SAIS faculty supported the war, but David and Fukuyama were against it. So would anyone like to, also anyone on the panel to add to their remarks or?
I'll just say one thing in response to what Avis just said about, maybe he would see that Trump's nasty push to the Europeans, anti-European attitudes might finally force Europe to get its act together, and that wouldn't be all bad. I chaired him on a panel at one of our annual conferences at the IISS at some time late in the Iraq War or towards the end of the Bush administration, and he addressed just that theme. And I remember him saying, with that very sort of wit and smile he had, about the United States and Europe, he said, if after 8 years of the George W. Bush administration, Europe hasn't gotten its act together, there's not much more that we Americans can do for you. Oh, there is more we can do for you.
Yes. I think we have a microphone.
I have a naive question to the slaves. How did it actually work? How long did you stay there? I mean, it's fascinating from a teacher's perspective how that circle actually operated. And I think our younger audience have no idea, and you made some assumptions that we all knew, but was it 3 weeks? Was it a day? How long did you slave? And what was the myth of Elba is associated with David Calleo. And for those who didn't know him and are too young, I think it would be enlightening to tell us a little bit about that family and the atmosphere, and then obviously you were there and so on. So I think from the new generations, I mean, publications, impact factors, and so on were probably an alien world to the world that you describe. And if you can enlighten us, that would be eye-opening, at least to me.
Just going to say one word, that the conditions of this slavery were so terrible and so onerous that I sent both of my children into it many years later, and I think my son went back every summer for 12 years or something.
Yeah, same with mine. I mean, I was talking to my son about the Elba slavery last night, and he said, yeah, it was a golden period. I mean, it was a wonderful memory. I think he went 2 or 3 times, but because they were part of, it was all part of a community, and it was very beautiful. The whole setting was attractive, and they just felt they were part of something rather special. And they were junior members of it, obviously, but then they went back, and then there was, as in classical Athens, there was a possibility of graduation to a higher level. as you moved up, you could give up planting the trees and doing the garden thing, and join the group discussing higher things on the terrace.
I think the jobs in Elba were sought after. I mean, I think there were maybe towards the end, but he always had a plethora of candidates who
And
wanted
that
to
was
come.
from Yale, was it? Was it mainly
Well,
from Yale? It was the Yale connection?
Were they young students, or were they already like professors?
No. They were graduate students. They were SAIS students. They were sometimes undergraduates from Yale or elsewhere. We even had some high school students, and I think really, I've run into many of them in my life, and they all had happy memories of it. I mean, the memories of lifting the stones and unrooting the trees, those have, like pain. It's memory
They
phase.
were creating something
Yes,
lovely
yes.
as well.
And
they felt part. It was a hierarchical thing, wasn't it?
David cared a lot about food and drink, so we always ate well, right? Can I say that?
Yeah.
Yes, thanks to one of the cooking slaves. And so, you ate well and you had lots of interesting discussions.
And of course, it was an entrance into Europe for many
Yes,
people.
yes.
You stayed there. You did your months there, and then you sort of launched out and sort of saw Europe for a bit, and then went back. So it was a way of, and there was a bit of money. I think they got a bit of money, didn't they?
They did.
the
They
slaves?
got.
I don't know.
It was not princely, but they got room and board.
Yeah, exactly. There was a big dormitory, wasn't there?
For the guys.
So just to give you a little meat on the bones, right? You worked 8 hours a day from 8 in the morning until noon, and then from 4 in the afternoon until 8 in the evening, and then you would quickly shower, and then go to wine, right? Cocktails before dinner, and then you would sit down to a 5-course meal where you were not allowed to talk about frivolous things like
Under a
sports.
bust of Napoleon.
Yeah, you had to talk about serious things. And I'll never forget the dinner where I sat down and I was with Vigo and Bobby.
Yeah.
And Bobby looked at, Bobby,
This is very inside, okay?
so, but Bobby looked at us and she stopped and she looked across the table and she said, well, when I met Hitler, and I thought, oh, wow, you met Hitler, right?
Was this the wife of the British?
Daughter of the British ambassador
Daughter
to
of
Rome.
the British ambassador, yeah.
Right.
And so then she told about that experience, and that was kind of like a more serious thing than I expected in the 6 degrees of Philip or Kevin Bacon, right? I mean, I've moved up in the whole system in a very frightening way in that sudden turn of events. But there were all kinds of really interesting people who would float through. Now the reason I laughed about the stones is David had this theory that if you hit a stone with a sledgehammer in just the right spot, it would break into nice wall-sized building rocks, right? And that theory we tried many thousands of times and nobody ever hit the stone in the right spot. But David was convinced that spot existed, right? So being out there breaking rocks in the sun in Tuscany in the middle of the summer is an experience. And in the metaphor I would draw you to would be the original version with Ralph Macchio of the Karate Kid, right? Because that's how we learned European politics: wax on, wax off.
But that's the slave's perspective. I mean, one of the important aspects of Elba was that it was where David increasingly wrote his books, and I mean, it was all set up in a way that, in a way he could do it. There were the research slaves. I mean, a couple of research assistants who sort of helped and typed out things, and he discussed ideas with. And then at the end of every 2 or 3 months, there was a draft of a book. Maybe it took 2 years, but there was. And so it was a production factory in that sense. I mean, it wasn't only a gardening estate, it produced books, it produced things. And of course, the people he brought and who wanted to talk, he wanted to talk with, and I think I was one of them, we also stimulated him, and he would write his stuff. So there were these drafts, he would write them all in hand. Then one of the slaves would type them out, and then they'd be discussed, and then they'd be changed. And this is what happened, wasn't it? And then at the end of the summer, there was 3 months, 2 or 3 months, long American holidays, academic holidays, a draft of a book would be there.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add that everything was written by hand. I think even to the end of his life, I don't think he ever made the transition to word processing. But so that he would write by hand, and then, as you say, so one of the slaves would type it, and then he would annotate it, sometimes with A's and B's and C's and arrows, but he fortunately had beautiful handwriting. David had which is an expression of his personality, had very elegant handwriting. about the best I've ever seen, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Easy to decipher.
Easy to
Yeah.
decipher and pleasant to read, fortunately. So you could never use the excuse that I couldn't read your writing if you didn't do what you were supposed to do. Yeah. The other thing was it was Platonic, but also Napoleonic, because there was the decor was Napoleonic. I mean, the pictures on the walls were all original prints and paintings that he had collected of Napoleon's battles and various scenes from Napoleon's life. And of course, Napoleon had been on Elba for only 9 months, but
I mean, of course, the history and the romance of Napoleon was deeply. But David, philosophically, couldn't have been a Napoleon supporter. I mean, Napoleon was a hegemon. He wanted to conquer Europe. Yeah, so he was opposite of de Gaulle. So the two things can't be reconciled, really, can they?
well, he often quoted de Gaulle on the costs of Napoleon's hubris.
Yeah.
He was aware that it wasn't destined to last, but it was glorious as long as it did.
Yeah.
You couldn't help it.
Yeah.
Be fascinated by Napoleon's victories, and he had there were battle scenes in the dining room, I remember, Wagram and Austerlitz and in one room, and Friedland and Jena in another room. And then when Elba was finally sold, I think we split up the Napoleonic
Napoleon
pictures.
pictures,
I have a couple at home, I think, and our colleague Tom Rowe has some. You guys, did you miss out on Napoleon's paintings? Yeah. Anyway, so Kamala Harris, we have about 2 minutes left. And I'm afraid we're going to have to cut it short, at least for some of the company must, there'll be your transportation will be waiting
Are
for
we all
you.
going out to dinner?
We're going out to dinner.
A little platonic session, shall
We're
we?
going to have
There's a question there.
But there's a question.
why don't, Avis and Robert, why don't you, and Adrian, why don't you prepare to meet the taxi? Because I'm told at 8 sharp, the guy, he's gone, so
Okay, but can we just hear the question?
Sure.
Yeah.
we don't.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. My name's Ben Newman-Sanders. I'm studying international relations here. I wanted to ask, if Kamala Harris was elected president, what could Europe do to try and turn the relationship around? Because it seems like even if it took its military responsibilities as seriously as the Americans would like, the decline is very real in terms of the relationship, and I wanted to know your opinions on what Europeans could do to restore the relationship or at least strengthen it.
I would have said that actually under Biden that relations have been not so bad, certainly not so bad as sometimes I can remember. We've all been together on the same page on Ukraine, at least for now, and we've avoided fighting about the Middle East, although I imagine there are plenty of European countries that don't agree with us. But I think the Europeans should face up to the possibility of, as I mentioned, I think there's a long-term trend, and something that the Europeans should be doing is preparing for the day when America's support will be less. I don't know when that will be. With Trump, it would certainly be sooner rather than later. And I think building up their own defense capability is really important.
And where I would like to enter a conversation on this is that they've been told this for 50 years. I mean, and it's always been a case of, well, America's support can't be relied on forever, therefore you've got to build up your own defensive capacity, and they've had these sort of efforts to construct European forces, but always NATO has been a counter-attraction, and of course with Ukraine, NATO has actually moved right into the center of things. Now, this may only be a temporary boost for NATO as against a separate European defence capacity, but it may, I mean, we don't know where it's going to go. At the moment, Europe is not an independent player. It is an integral member of NATO. NATO is controlled by the United States. And where is Europe?
Well, I think.
Conversation.
Conversation, yes. Well, I would just say that I think that the Europeans have been, you know, first of all, they've done a lot more than they're often given credit for on Ukraine. And I think they feel that Ukraine is pretty close to a threat to them. And so I think that has helped the unity. But I think the threat to the unity will come not from Europe, but from the United States and what happens in our election.
I mean, it's a central question, which I tried to raise in my remarks. And I think that there's a great danger, of course, if Harris is elected, that this will be a cause for complacency on the part of Europe, because, I mean, it's true she's of a different generation and looks forward, but she will be in large measure a continuation of the Biden foreign policy, attachment to Europe, maybe without the same visceral connection, but attachment to Europe, support for Europe, and support for Ukraine insofar as, I mean, the sustainability of this support might be in question, but the difference between Trump demanding a deal and a Harris administration demanding a deal is, I think, Ukraine could make a deal under Harris with confidence that that some sort of security guarantee, maybe not NATO enlargement, but some serious security commitment from the United States and from Europe would gel and be a safe basis to preserve Ukrainian sovereignty and security wherever the lines are drawn, however much land that Russia unjustly conquers. But there was another important point here, which is, part of the problem is that, on the one hand, it's been perfectly logical. I often said this. America has, going back to John Foster Dulles, the Eisenhower administration has demanded more effort from Europe, more military effort. Sorry, we're having a little change of scene here. But if I were a member, honestly, if I were a member of the Bundestag and I was exhorted to devote more spending to German military spending, but I knew that America's commitment was undying, would be perfectly logical for me to favor social spending more than military spending. It would be the right thing to do, honestly, because the difference in German spending, I'm talking about under those old circumstances, was marginal and mainly meant to keep the Americans happy. So I think that, we may be in a different situation where they may take things more seriously. The other thing I want to say is that, we tend to, I think, and again, going back to David Calleo, he was always very keen in understanding the real contributions of Europe, even if he criticized them for being anemic on the defense side. And, their involvement in the diplomacy that led to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, was critical. It was when the European Union decided that it was not going to import another drop of Iranian crude oil that the Iranians were ready to make a deal. But then the Europeans saw an American president, Donald Trump, simply tear that deal up, which was working. And we are now in a situation, then we were in a situation where Iran was a year away from having enough fissile material to make a nuclear weapon, and they're now literally weeks or days away. I mean, that doesn't mean they could make a nuclear weapon, but the main ingredient they would have. So this is another way. It's not just a question of military burden. It's also a question of being able to protect yourself against American political aberrance, in a sense. There was no logic to tearing up the JCPOA. It ruined everyone's security and was a dagger at the heart of Europe's sense of its cooperation and multilateral values and cooperation with the United States.
Yeah, but I think Europe at the moment, it's not playing any part in the world commensurate with its economic power, and I think that's largely because there's no way Germany can assume any leadership role, effective leadership role. I mean, there was the German-French alliance, which was the only force that could have, provided sort of leadership for a more united Europe, but that doesn't work at the moment. I mean, what terrifies me now, I have to say, and I think this should terrify any student of international relations or foreign policy at the moment with any historical sense. If you take the way the Second World War started, it became a fusion of a number of separate wars, actually. That created the World War. Now we have three potential wars, some actual wars and some. We have the Ukraine war, we have the Middle East, and we have Taiwan, China. Any of those could explode. I don't think we've got any coherent way of thinking about this. That's the international relations situation, as against which there are these huge climatic challenges, I mean planetary challenges, which demand cooperation. How do we get cooperation out of the present situation in geopolitics? How do we get cooperate? We've got to cooperate with China. We've got to cooperate with Russia. We've got to cooperate with other BRICS. We have to. I mean, we're not arbiters of the world's fate in NATO. I mean, there are other countries around, and we've got to talk to them. Diplomacy is a matter of talking to people. That's what I feel very strongly. And I think international relations, should have emphasized that. So I'm a bit of an evangelist on this. I'm not just a sort of, cool analyst saying, well, there's this possibility and that possibility. I really fear for the future of our planet.
Thank you. Erik, I'm going to give you the last word, maybe. A happy note, maybe you can end on. But
No, I mean, the question I think is a fair one, which is what should the Europeans do, right? And I'll do this in bullet points so we can get out of here and go get dinner. The first thing is that they've got to elevate the transatlantic technology, the TTC, transatlantic technology cooperation to regulatory convergence and possibly bring back something that looks a lot more like the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. This is an essential component in restoring the transatlantic economy and strengthening the businesses that work on both sides. And that's not happening, but it could happen. There will be domestic political opposition on both sides that will need to be overcome, but it's possible. There has to be, and this I realize is going to be much more controversial, there has to be a coordinated strategy for de-risking from China because of the way that supply chains are running right now, and because the United States can't but de-risk. And for Europeans, this puts them in an awkward situation where, because of the way the United States is de-risking through control over intellectual property, Europeans are being forced to choose about which intellectual property they're going to embed in their supply chains. And in those choices, they're going to find themselves having to decide whether they'll line up with the United States or with China. I think they should make that decision sooner rather than later. And since the question was about how to restore the transatlantic relationship, I think they've got to restore it with the United States. And I think that's very unfortunate because it's going to antagonize China. I just don't know how to get around that. The third thing is that the Europeans are going to have to do what Draghi is asking them to do. Complete the capital markets union so that they can more efficiently use their own capital, which means also macroeconomic rebalancing, which is something that you'll learn about in your macro class at some point in the second semester. But the key thing is that they will have to change the way they think about competitiveness within Europe's internal market, to bring in more of these non-market instruments that I talked about, but particularly to bring in buy local provisions like they use in the United States. That's going to be very difficult for Europeans to do, particularly in terms of public procurement, but it's going to be essential to ensure the legitimacy of this transformation. It's going to require some adaptation at the European level. Those are three economic things. There's a fourth thing that's even more controversial and more challenging, and that is they will have aggressively to pursue enlargement of the European Union to include the Eastern three, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, and the countries of the Western Balkans. Ukraine is absolutely vital to bring in. And this is where I know we're going to get into an interesting conversation over dinner in order to stabilize the line of contact between Russia and Ukraine, wherever it may lie, because there is no way that line of contact is going to be stable unless we're able. Well, the Turks that I just came from, the Turks are quite eager, but there's no way that line of contact will be stable without credible bilateral security guarantees. There's no way to make those bilateral security guarantees credible without the economic interdependence.
John, can I?
And there's no way the EU can provide those bilateral security dilemmas or the security guarantees.
John, can I say
Anyway,
one thing?
no, you can't. We have to stop. But this is going to be, I'm sorry to be arbitrary, but this discussion will be continued, by the way, on the 14th of November with the results of the election, if there are results of the election, in mind. We're going to continue this. So hope to see you all then, and thank you for coming.
Do you want this as a souvenir, or can I have it?
You can have it. You frame it.
I think